Hello, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today about my experiences over the last 10 plus years of working in distributed teams as a software developer. So, as way of introduction, I know Jay through the Agile community, especially through the Agile Uprising podcast. My name is Sam Hogarth. I am a software developer based in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, so Northern England, if you're wondering where the accent is from. I am a lead engineer working in the web space in the insurance value stream at Tesco Bank. Tesco are the UK's largest supermarket, effectively. Not at the scale of Walmart, but pretty much our Walmart. And I work in the banking arm, so we offer credit cards, savings accounts, loans, insurance to customers in the UK. As a software developer, I've been doing this since 2010 professionally, and I've got a lot of battle scars working across web, mobile, cloud. A lot of my experience is in the financial sector, both working directly for companies and also consulting. I've also had a little bit of experience in the bioinformatics sector as well. My background is actually in video games, but I never managed to do that professionally. The central thesis, if you want to go to the pub and just take away this one message, is that distributed working is really challenging because to make it work, it requires a continued investment in people and processes to add value. It comes with a huge amount of trade-offs. A lot of the time in software, in product management, what we are doing is understanding the various different things that we are trying to trade off and then making a judgment call. There isn't a right answer per se on where this falls for people in general. What you have to do is apply this thinking to your own context and understand what kind of team do you want to build, what kind of team do you want to work in, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and make a conscious decision on where you're going to sit on those lines. So, why do people bother having globally distributed teams? When it comes down to the brass tacks, the big reason is the economics of it. Hiring software developers in the US, in Northern America, and in Western Europe is expensive, and it is much cheaper to hire software developers based in other parts of the world. And historically, this has been called offshoring. We'll come back to that term. I don't like it, but essentially, the economics of it comes into the fray. The idea that it is cheaper to build this software if we have a team in a remote site build it. But things have also changed, and the idea that remote working is becoming more of a norm means that actually you can have teams distributed because a talent pool in a particular city where your office is physically located might be completely dry, but you can look to other cities, and if you're looking for a .NET developer or a Java developer, then you may be able to reach out to somewhere else in the same country or very nearby and find talent that you wouldn't be able to find if you were so dependent on the physical location. It works both ways, and I'm of the opinion that having a good amount of diversity in a team is important, and that diversity isn't just the color of our skin or our kind of gender. It's also our backgrounds, where we work, what cultural expectations and norms we bring to a situation. All of that plays into things. This makes our teams stronger. You do have to work, but it does make our teams stronger and more cohesive. The other big reason is if you're running real-time systems and you have some kind of service level agreement in place, uptimes, or if there is downtime in a service that you have to basically fix them within a certain amount of time, or else you have to go to a regulator and perhaps have a fine. It's quite common to have teams working at various places across the globe, handing off to each other as their day ends and the new day begins, as the sun moves, so that we can keep people from an operation perspective looking at the systems, checking their uptime, and being primed to fix things if they go wrong. I look after a few teams in insurance within Tesco Bank. Our primary office location is in Edinburgh in Scotland in the United Kingdom. We also have offices in Glasgow and in Newcastle. You can see I'm at home. I do most of my working from home these days. As an insurance company, we have underwriting, and the vast majority of that work takes place in Newcastle, but also in Surrey, south of London in the UK. We have some external contractors who provide software development for us in Romania, and we have a kind of huge off-site area in Bengaluru in India. And that provides software development, testing, operations. Quite a lot of stuff comes out of India these days. Immediately, that presents quite an interesting challenge for us, because looking at this, you can kind of see that doesn't give us a huge amount of opportunity to synchronize our activity. Romania, 2 to 3 hours ahead, depending on whether it's summertime. India, 5.5 hours ahead. So 9 o'clock in the morning in the UK, when we're just coming into the office, it's nearly lunchtime in Romania. Folks in India are just getting back from lunch. So that's a pretty good time to coordinate, but pretty quickly it becomes difficult. If we have a meeting at 10 o'clock, well, we're eating into somebody's lunchtime in Romania. If we have a meeting at noon in the UK, we're kind of catching the folks in India just before they're leaving the door. If we try and have meetings in the afternoon in the UK with the full team, it's not even worth bothering with, because folks in India are home, the folks in Romania are probably heading home as well. So when you're dealing in a distributed team, you kind of can't get over the fact that there are these kind of scheduling issues that come into play. When you're working in a team distributed across different time zones, ultimately you have to perform handoffs between those teams. You have to share the context of what has been going on. And this comes with a few drawbacks. Essentially, it creates longer feedback loops. If you're handing over a piece of work to a different time zone and then you're finishing for the day, it's basically going to take a full day. If somebody misunderstands what they're meant to do, or if they have any questions that they can't answer for themselves. So there is a lengthening of the amount of time it takes to actually get answers on things, or do course correction if something isn't particularly well understood. The scheduling of things gives us a reduced opportunity to collaborate. And what we've found is that we do have to have more formal, explicit requirements to make up for that. We do have to do a lot more work up front to make sure that everybody has a shared understanding of what it is that we need to build, and we do often go into a bit more detail than other teams, perhaps co-located, would when specifying what needs to be done. Primarily because we don't want to be hit by the longer feedback cycle. the big difference that a lot of people will highlight when working across the globe is differences in culture. There's a lot of, frankly, stereotypical and occasionally racist takes on this on the internet. If you look at it, there is also a few things that are true or well observed within those perspectives. Norms and conventions differ wherever you go. Even within a particular country, different cities have different norms and conventions. So, for instance, when a British person asks how you are at the start of a conversation, we're expecting to hear "okay" or "not bad, thanks," regardless of the state that you're in, regardless if you're in the middle of a crisis or whether you're feeling on top of the world. It's more a, how do I say, it's more kind of like just a rote piece of filler at the start of a conversation. It's also been observed that British people love talking about the weather, and the reason we do this, again, it's to fill conversation at the start of a meeting in a broadly inoffensive way. But it also is because in Britain we get so much weather. There's a lot of different air fronts that coalesce over the UK, which makes the weather unpredictable and occasionally interesting. Language is a big challenge, actually. If you're working across the globe, normally the language that you conduct the business in is in English. From my observation, even in companies whose central office isn't in the UK, they normally perform their business in English. But it's not always the case, and certainly it means that folks who don't have English as their native language will be speaking English as a second, third, maybe even fourth language. So there is a communication barrier that can occur there, and sure, my team's English is better than my non-existent Hindi or Romanian, yeah? So you do have to kind of give and take both ways, and I think it really means you have to focus on your communication, on the clarity. There's a lot of things that you will just say, like an idiom that might be well understood within your local area that somebody from a different part of the world just may not understand. Or you may use some kind of idioms or turn of phrases which actually might be insensitive in other areas as well, but not locally in your context. There's also, I couldn't think of a right phrase for this, but there is intersectional dynamics that comes into play here. There is very often not just the fact that we're in different time zones that comes into play. Often, if we have a distributed team, we have to also respect that there may be a permanent employee versus contractor relationship, which has an inherent power imbalance. There's a lot of things like that you just have to kind of work around and understand. As a contractor myself in the past, I've been in situations where a permanent member of staff who wasn't on my team, but took the perspective that any contractor for the company worked for them directly, and it was their right as a permanent employee to issue commands for them to do. And that's not how the relationship typically works. That's not a normal perspective on that relationship. You should be aiming to try and, regardless of your working situation, treat people as equals, meet people where they are. But people do have these different understandings of where this relationship lies. And when you're remote and distributed, forming interpersonal relationships is also a lot more difficult. It's easy to quickly grab a lunch with somebody when you're in an office together, or have a kind of after work meet up in the pub where you can effectively just understand a bit more about a person, what they're bringing to work, and not have everything on such a formal work-based grounds. You can understand a bit about the person. Doing this remotely or in a distributed way, it can be done. It requires a lot more effort. You have to put the work in. And we do also have to admit that there are a lot of biases that go on. Prejudice, it is still a thing. Hopefully, I don't see as much of it as I used to, especially now that I'm out of consulting. It's a really difficult one. You do have to flag that kind of stuff up when you see it. What I see more often is stereotyping. And again, a lot of the literature that you look at online actually takes quite negative stereotypes of different cultures and takes a perspective that this is just the way things are and you need to work with that, which I don't find particularly helpful. The biggest challenge I still see is geocentric thinking. So I was talking earlier about how Edinburgh is our head office. We have to work really hard to remind ourselves that, well, not everybody is in Edinburgh, not everyone is in the UK, actually. So it's great that we have this office, but even for me in Newcastle, it's a 2.5 hour commute to get there. So we have to make sure that people aren't basically on subject of favouritism because they can be present in a physical space. And likewise, we have to make sure that we don't have cliques forming within practices or within teams based on location. So we work really hard to make sure that the folks in India and Romania are well integrated into the team and that we don't just naturally fall into different silos. One thing I'm really working on is trying to remove the term offshoring from our lingo, because when a lot of us are working remotely, even from different cities in the same country, the idea of having an onshore, I think, can start to promote a bit of an us and them mentality. From my time in consulting, we used to offer what we called a nearshoring model, which was, we're in the same time zone, okay, so you don't have that to deal with, but we're cheaper because we're in a different city. And again, working in essentially the second site in the consultancy, you did end up with a us and them dynamic between the permanent employees based on the client's physical site and us in this satellite office. So we have to make sure that the way we work is fully inclusive and isn't biased towards a particular physical location, a particular group of people. And also the technology. Thankfully, it's got better, but we've had a huge amount of problems with provisioning equipment, especially in the UK since Brexit, getting things over the borders, getting people in to collect physical equipment. It's all been made more difficult. So we have to factor in all of this stuff when provisioning equipment for people. We also have to think about the availability of services. So touching on the connectivity piece as well here, we had an instance a few years back where one of our developers based in India wasn't as productive as the rest of the team. And it took us a while to dig into why this is, as developers based in the UK were using MacBooks, highly provisioned MacBooks. We could kind of do stuff really quickly, really effectively. We had fantastic tooling so that we could keep them up to date. We could install approved software, all that kind of stuff with very little configuration. Our developer based in India didn't have a MacBook. He was using a Windows machine, which was actually a virtual machine he had to remote desktop connection to, so it was subject to lag. And then to do specific other pieces of work, he had to then, from that machine, connect to another virtual machine, which was under provisioned, through a remote desktop connection, it got to the point where he was moving the mouse on his screen, and it was taking more than 10 seconds for that update to be reflected on his screen. We fixed it. We improved a lot of the technology. We upgraded our virtual machines. We provisioned them. We configured some security groups so he didn't have to do as many hoop jumping, all that kind of stuff. But you also have to think of the personal impact there, right? Like, the technology that we'd given him was hindering him from doing his job, and how demotivating must that be, and how isolating must that feel if you're on the other side of the world and you're not getting that help. And we had to work really hard to get all that stuff stood up and fight a lot of internal bureaucracy. The nobody else is complaining, we can't make an exception for this person, etc., etc. Things changed. Here's some coronavirus that I found in my kids' art and craft box. Things changed quite a lot when the pandemic hit. I think a lot of software developers were used to working remotely in some way, even if it was on a second site, physically co-located with a bunch of people. We had this understanding that you would occasionally have to remotely connect to things. We configured all of our stuff so that it was available remotely. But for a lot of folks who worked on the product and commercial side of our teams, lockdown, when it happened, kind of forced their ways of working to change fairly significantly. When everybody came remote and people were exposed to this for the first time, I think it kind of started to unveil a bit of a way forward for how to deal with distributed teams, which is what I want to turn my attention onto now as we start to close up. I think the primary thing when working in a remote or a distributed team, there are differences, but the primary thing is learning how to leverage asynchronous working practices. And by that I mean people can schedule the work around their availability, their constraints inside and outside of work, in a way that reduces the need for synchronous and delayed feedback loops. I feel like doing this properly can be a great leveler, because the alternative, and we saw a lot of this during the start of the pandemic, was for these long and frequent all hands style meetings where everything was done synchronously. We have terms like Zoom fatigue now to describe the kind of lethargic effect that has on us. So we need to find better ways of working which are more humane, which are more grounded and oriented to the way that people want to actually work. Working in an asynchronous fashion requires a few, pillars of discipline, both individual and as a group, and it needs to be based on respect, openness, and trust. So a lot of times when we're talking about how to build things, we're trying to prevent malicious actors in the team, and what happens if somebody spends the day watching YouTube, and actually we need to turn that on its head and say, well, we should have a fundamental assumption here that our team are professionals. They want to do the right thing, they want to work together, they want to contribute and feel valued, and we should be talking about what we can do to enable and reinforce those behaviours. It requires a foundation of strong communication. A great quote, it's often but incorrectly attributed to George Bernard Shaw, an Irish playwright. That's not who it came from. I don't think anybody actually does know where it came from, but it's true nonetheless. The biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So what we need to do in order to work asynchronously is to be really explicit about how we communicate, in what styles we communicate, and why we do that. This is a little bit of a rant, but it's a good example of how we can use the technology in the wrong way. On instant messages clients, it's really easy for somebody to type hi and press send, and then wait for a response from the other person. This turns an interaction into a synchronous interaction. I have to reply, the other person has to wait for me to reply in order for the conversation to continue. This style of communication is not helpful asynchronously. So to fix this, we need to kind of adapt our communication style. You don't need to say hi and wait for a reply. Write a full sentence. State what it is. Don't be afraid of writing a bit more information. I know it's an instant messaging client. It doesn't mean it's instant. It's a bit of a misnomer, to be honest. If you're going to send somebody a message, give them the context. Ask them what you want them to do. Sure, add some formalities. There's nothing wrong with that, but just don't send it as a separate message. If you have any expectations on timescales that this piece of activity needs to be done by, put that in the message as well. Give the full context to the person, and then let them, based on their own schedule, their own priorities, etc., manage this incoming request. We also are very explicit about how we organize our information and the stream of information coming to people. It's very easy with chat clients like Teams and Slack for there to just be one big constant stream of information that can overload people. If you've got the notification sound on your machine, you just hear it go bing, 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 and it can be quite jarring. The last thing we want to do is unnecessarily break people's concentrations. So we use different channels for different types of messages, which again lets people filter based on what's important to them. If they want to do a bit of deep focus, they can mute various channels and still not be worried that they're going to miss out on an urgent announcement if something comes up. So we have channels for team level announcements. We have a separate channel for any pull requests, so if anybody wants to do a code review, they post it in there. We have a separate channel for Q&As, so if anybody just has a general question, that can be answered, and then we get just a nice thread where that's all kept separate. Ongoing deployments, I need to hook this up to an RSS feed, but right now, when someone is deploying our code to a test environment, they'll put it in this chat that it's going on. And again, it means everybody has a central view of which version is in an environment, is there a deployment running, all that kind of stuff. And we also leave space for social stuff. We keep it separate, so again, it's opt-in. People can choose to look at that stuff based on their time, their priorities. But we have places where we kind of loosen the guardrails a bit, have a bit of fun, post YouTube links, music, etc. And we try and keep all of our information available online in some way. If we do work as small groups, physical, with post-its or whiteboards, we'll normally take a photograph of those and upload them as well, so the full context, the golden source, is one of our online sources of information. So we have Jira for ticket management, Confluence, which is our internal wiki for readmes and meeting notes and all that kind of stuff. We're moving from Miro to Figma for our UI screenshots. So when we have the design team mock up things that we need to build, we kind of collaborate on those using Figma. We have logging, monitoring, alerting through a combination of Datadog and Splunk. So these are all available online and people can get to them and self-serve their information. And on that, again, you have to be very purposeful about the way that you communicate and share context with your team. I call it helping people to help themselves. So it's easy in the fray of developing to make decisions or to add complexity on how to set up a project or how something works. And if you have team members changing, coming into the group, or perhaps bringing a different skill set in, they may find that picking up the slack and running with it and understanding what it is they're building and why it's been built this way is difficult if you've lost all that context. So if we take significant architectural decisions, we will document these as decision records where we'll explain the problem we're trying to solve, what it is we want to do, what other options we considered, and what we went with. So people can look over those and just gain more context that way. We place a lot of focus in our how-tos and readmes to make sure that setting up and running our software for a local developer or tester is as easy as possible. We do, using Microsoft Stream, small recorded videos and screencasts. So if we want to do deep dives into a particular area, like what is the sequence of interactions in order to make a payment, we will basically just screencast that, share it with the group, stick it on Confluence so people can look back. And that allows people to get up to speed very quickly with where we are and how things work. They don't have to trawl through the code to find that out themselves. The other side of asynchronous working is the synchronous working, where we actually do come together and build something. At Tesco Bank, we call synchronous working moments that matter. And when you have a team distributed across the country and the globe, what you want to do is maximize the effectiveness of synchronous interactions, because you don't get a huge amount of time. As I was showing you earlier, you don't get a huge amount of time in which you can perform stuff synchronously. You don't want that time spent in pointless meetings. You want that time spent in the most effective way possible, adding value. So by being deliberate about your asynchronous work, you can be more deliberate about what you choose to do synchronously. I call this purposeful interactions rather than moments that matter. I think it's a bit cheesy, but code reviews as conversations. It's easy for a developer to fire up some code, create a pull request, it gets posted to the channel, and they just hop off to the next piece of work. I'm trying to encourage people to have face-to-face calls and talk through the code and have that kind of context sharing done in person if possible, so that the user who is reviewing the code just has that context and that base understanding of the problem trying to be solved. As a team lead, I schedule regular office hours sessions, which is time on my diary that I make free for anybody to drop in on a one-to-one basis and talk to me. And it doesn't have to be about work. Sometimes it's just catching up with people. That gives us an opportunity to share a lot of context that way, cuts out a lot of formalities as well. We're really keen on team socials. We do virtual stuff like playing games together, or we will kind of watch a YouTube video. If it's like a tech talk or something, talk about it. Sometimes we'll just kind of grab a coffee over lunch, just have a chat about things and stuff for a while, not work, just to build those interpersonal interactions. And I'm starting to get a bit strict about meeting etiquette as well, primarily to push back against pointless meetings, but also to make sure that the meetings we do have are purposeful. There are actions that come out of it. There's an agenda. If people want us to look over something, don't, for instance, host a meeting and talk us through a PowerPoint, okay? Because we could have just looked through that in our own time. So how about share the slides out in advance, even screencast it like I'm doing now, pre-record it, send it out to people, and then use the meeting as a Q&A session. Also having regular one-to-ones, and it may not be straight down the line management chain. I have people I line manage who I have one-to-ones with, and I also just have ad hoc one-to-ones with some folks in Romania and India where we just kind of talk about, look, how are you finding things? Do you have everything you need? Is there anything more we can do to help? So you deliberately break the org chart and try and build all those informal interactions that hang around it. And just to touch on, I guess, what the problem we're trying to solve at the moment, the big thing for the organisation, because we work according to the Scaled Agile framework, we have a quarterly planning session, and we've done 3 of these so far, so it's still very new to us. They're basically 2-day on-site meetings where you get everybody in the same room, talk about the work that is to be done, map out the dependencies between teams, and come up with a plan on how you're going to deliver this quarter. Now, what we did initially was flew over the folks from Romania because it was economical to do so, but the folks in India just didn't take part. They were initially excluded, and several of us in the organisation pushed back against this. We know with the climate crisis and actually just cost of living crisis that flying folks over from India, it's difficult and it's probably not desirable as well. So we needed to find a different way to solve that problem, but make sure that they were included. And what we're kind of experimenting with at the moment is having 2 physical concurrent sessions. So we've invested a lot in the technology so that at the start of the PI planning, where the kind of the leaders of the value stream provide the goals and ambitions for this quarter, where we talk about the solution architecture, the presentations at the start, basically. We will simulcast these to the office in Bengaluru, so folks in the UK and Europe can meet physically together, folks in India can meet physically together, and we link the 2 offices together. We have breakout spaces for each of the teams, so when they go their separate ways and do their planning, we have teleconferencing equipment in each of these small breakout spaces so that the 2 teams can communicate together. What we found was, even though we were still all physically in the same room in both offices, actually having everybody join the meeting from their own laptops was better than having just a Polycom in the middle of a desk, because it meant you could see everybody's faces. It meant that you could get better sound from the individuals. It just puts everyone on a more even footing. So I think we've still got work to do there. It is a big challenge, especially right now. It's done as 2 days UK time, so the folks in India are up working pretty late, and we might have to do something different there. But that, in a nutshell, is my experience of working with remote and distributed teams. And I'm going to meet you all virtually in a moment, but live, to do some Q&A. So thank you very much for your time.